John Newman will be speaking to us about one very specific, breaking in new lips today, one very specific omission, and it's a great pleasure to introduce John. He's the author, of JFK and Vietnam. He will have a new book this spring, Lee Harvey Oswald and the CIA.
Right, we already went over that.
Just in case anybody didn't know. And as I only learned this week, having seen it for about the 35th time, he is a member of the cast of the movie JFK, which I got a kick out of, not having recognized him the first 34 times. So please welcome Dr. John Newman.
Good morning, and I have just a few words to share with you this morning. I'm saving my thunder for this evening. I believe the largest omission is Oswald's Cuban story, and I'm going to show you what's new in the files tonight. I'm going to take an hour to go through this material. I'm going to talk about something right now that I will not have time to go into, which concerns the FBI. Mostly what we're going to see tonight is the CIA, some FBI material, and the CIA perspective of it. But what I want to talk to you right now about is a huge defect, which has really been there for 30 years. And that defect concerns Oswald's FBI files in this city, in Dallas. What I'm talking about is an FBI file on Lee Harvey Oswald that is not the FBI file that is in the National Archives. I'm talking about Oswald's Dallas FBI files. We have today in the National Archives a Dallas file on Lee Harvey Oswald, Dallas FBI file on Lee Harvey Oswald. We also have such a file, of course, from New Orleans, from New York, from Chicago, and in fact, it's surprising how many FBI field offices actually had some records on Lee Harvey Oswald. Headquarters opened a file on Oswald immediately after his defection. Now, what I want to talk to you about is the number, the serial that the FBI attaches to these pieces of paper. Quite apart from what's in the documents, students of the case will be fascinated now that we have all these documents to study those numbers, whether they're CIA numbers or FBI numbers. Now, for the very devoted amongst you here, I would refer you to Commission Exhibits 833 and 834, I believe. And I'm speaking on the fly here, so please forgive me if I've misspoken about this. But they're in the Warren documents, the exhibits. And what we have here are two FBI exhibits which describe Lee Harvey Oswald's FBI records. I believe in the first case, 833 purports to be a complete listing of what the FBI held on Lee Harvey Oswald prior to the assassination. In other words, the FBI's pre-assassination file. When you look at this list, it becomes evident, if you've studied very closely all of his FBI records, that there is something big missing from this list, which is in the Warren somewhere in the Warren volumes, and that's a report written by John Fain in May of 1960. At this time, of course, the headquarters file had been open now several months. The headquarters of the FBI, or the Bureau, had assigned the serial 105. In fact, the entire number is 105-82555. That would be Lee Harvey Oswald's headquarters FBI file. Now, these numbers mean something. Not the numbers after the dash so much as what comes before it, because the numbers that come before it describe the functional nature of the file. And 105 is for counterintelligence. The headquarters opened up a counterintelligence file on Lee Harvey Oswald after his defection and left it open. In May 1960, John Fain wrote a report. In this report, it's about 7 pages long, It's a very extraordinary one, really. It's the first major report on Lee Harvey Oswald. About 7 pages, including a full description of him, the life and times of his youth and his joining the service and so on and so forth. It bore the serial 105. I believe -976, and again, forgive me, I'm doing this totally from memory right now. Within a year, there would be another file in Dallas on Lee Harvey Oswald, bearing the serial 100, and I do not recall at this very instant the rest of the numbers after that, so it would read 100 dash and several numbers. That's the file that is in the National Archives today. That is the file we have to look at when we ask the question, what did the Dallas FBI field office have on Lee Harvey Oswald? The problem with this is, what in the hell is the 105 number doing on the Fain report of May 1960? Did they do a one-time issue of this serial? It was a mistake and they changed it later? Well, we have enough evidence to know that's not what happened. What took place was a rather extraordinary FBI investigation into Lee Harvey Oswald. It involved FBI programs that were extremely sensitive. I spoke yesterday, I think, about this whole problem of Lee Oswald's files, if they're totally displayed, getting us into all sorts of sensitive government operations. I had in mind the H.T. Lingle program at the Central Intelligence Agency, where they actually had 4 or 5 people in LaGuardia Airport steaming open our mail with irons. They did this. You can read about it in the various government investigations that we've had along the years. Of course, it was illegal. And in this case, I believe we're dealing with the same problem set. In other words, the FBI had its own programs. And I believe here, I call it a bank tapping operation. I don't know that that's what they called it, but they had the ability to acquire information on bank transfers. And it may involve other programs, but at a minimum, what we were talking about in this case was an investigation into Lee Harvey Oswald that really proceeds through checking out Marguerite Oswald's bank transfers to Russia and everything that ensued from that. So the sequence goes something like this. Oh my gosh, my poor son. Look what's happened to him. He's over there in Russia. I must help him. And Marguerite makes some attempts to locate him, contact him, and to send him money. In fact, he's very coarse and cold about this. If you look at the record, he doesn't care about her. He hangs up the phone on her when she tries to phone him. He doesn't answer her letters other than to scrawl a little note, "Send money." It's about the only thing he had to say. So she attempted on several occasions to do that, and on the third attempt actually wired transferred funds, tried to make sure they would get to him. I don't know exactly what the sequence is. It may be that this automatically tripped a wire inside the FBI's system. But it leads to the Fain report. And the title of that report isn't Lee Harvey Oswald. It's called Funds Transferred to Russia. And it's very interesting that there is a whole string of documents that are put into this file, 105, I believe, as I said, 976, whatever it is. And this continues up through 1961, and amazingly enough, in 1963, in the new files, I found an FBI document from the summer of 1963, almost wholly redacted, by the way. It's all blacked out, but in the margin is handwriting, is an FBI clerk writing this, and it clearly shows 105-976. Still in 1963. This file's been open the entire time. It actually gives us a page reference, page 17. Now, paralleling the 105 file here in Dallas was a new file opened at the Bureau understand they already have a file open on him. I described it to you a minute ago, a counterintelligence file, 105-82555. At headquarters, they open a file with a different serial on it, 100. 100, by the way, a 100 series file in the FBI is something called internal security. In this case, I believe we've seen internal security Russia is most commonly what you see in FBI documents on Oswald. Internal security is not exactly the same thing as counterintelligence. Of course, it's related, but not necessarily the same. Investigating people who might be writing to the worker, the communist organizations aren't necessarily a counterintelligence case. They could be. Oswald's original file, of course, has to be because he's defected. And that's the context of the 105 opening at Bureau. And it's not surprising, to me anyway, that when Dallas opened its very first file, that they too would pick the 105 serial. But what we have here is a case when Dallas begins its investigation into Lee Harvey, Dallas FBI begins their investigation into Lee Harvey Oswald. Headquarters the Bureau opens a new file and assigns it a 100 serial. And all the information which is dumped into Oswald's Dallas 105 serial is dumped into the Bureau 100 serial. Now this pattern continues for over a year. Today, these files are missing. They're not even listed as ever having existed. Now that's not right. The law requires that if the government wants to withhold a record in this case, they may request postponement indefinitely, as long as they want to make the request for it. But they have to acknowledge the existence of these records. And by golly, a 7-page report on Lee Harvey Oswald is an assassination record, and the Warren Commission knew it, and that's why you can see the Fain report in the Warren, in the Warren, I forget which volume it is right now, frankly, but it's there. There's no question but this is a Lee Harvey Oswald document. But the thought of the FBI not even listing the 100 file at Bureau headquarters or the 105 file in Dallas boggles my mind. And I have broached this subject with the Review Board and the National Archives, and I can tell you that Steve Tilley, who is the archivist for the JFK records, was absolutely flabbergasted when I confronted him with these numbers. See, I have documents, and in fact, what makes this such a cut and dry case is the Fain report that I'm talking to you about. It stands there as a huge monument to this problem. It has the number right up on it, and it does not have the 100 number. So what we have here is an imagination, if you can understand conceptually. It's a bit complicated, but you have a counterintelligence file at headquarters. And then what happens is Dallas opens the counterintelligence file, the Bureau opens a internal security file, and all this data that proceeds from this incredible story of what Marguerite tries to do, transferring the funds. Fain goes out, interviews her, learns about Oswald's whole life, writes up a report. It goes through the intelligence committee, and then subsequent reports all go into these serials. And they're gone. It's interesting, the Dallas FBI office doesn't acknowledge having an investigation or a file on Oswald until 1961, in spite of the fact that we have this huge Fain report. Now, this problem doesn't end here. It also crops up in the case of New York City FBI field office. And the reason for that, I believe, is because the nature of the material that is going into these files that are hidden or haven't been acknowledged all flows from FBI actions being taken in New York City. So that, and I'm speaking now, I'm not showing you slides, I'm doing this in just a couple of minutes, but it would take, I'll have to ask you to trust me that the basis for this is totally documentary. But what happens is that when the bank transfer occurs, it is picked up in New York. The tripwire is actually in New York, where this transfer takes place. And it's the New York field office that gets the ball rolling. And we'll continue to do this in a number of interesting ways for the rest of Lee Harvey Oswald's life. Because when he writes to the Worker, the Communist Party USA paper, or to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, where do you think those letters go? They go to New York. The FBI is breaking into these places, or has an informant inside these organizations that is photographing Oswald's letters. You can see photographs of these letters in the Warren Commission report. It's the information from this type of black bag operations and illegal surveillance of Americans' bank accounts, and perhaps others, I believe that makes these files sensitive, without regard to the sensitivity of Oswald and the Oswald problem and the assassination of Kennedy. So we have two possibilities here. They're being hidden to protect sensitive programs, or they could be hidden because they're protecting some dastardly dark secret about the assassination. I don't know which one it is, and I don't really care at this point. I'm most concerned about getting the truth and forcing the FBI to acknowledge the existence of these files and to put them in the National Archives where they belong, and let the review board make the call on whether we should look at what's in these files or not. Now, I bring this to your attention as an omission on this panel, as a Warren omission, because the Warren Commission has the Fain report in it. They had the 105 Dallas number. And no one on that commission asked, well, wait a minute, this isn't from the file you gave us. This isn't even listed in CE 833. Where is this from? It's a huge defect. Furthermore, I would point out to those of you who are into the FBI story of Lee Harvey Oswald that there are other numbers besides these. There is another series on Oswald, which begins with, which is the numbers 65. And the reason we know this isn't because we're guessing. A researcher by the name of Paul Hoke, which many of you know, Paul has done some very fine work for the research community over the years in prying loose documents with FOI requests and badgering federal agencies with long letters. Well, Paul Hoke got hold of 3 or 4 documents many years ago in the 70s. And they mystified him because he didn't recognize any of the numbers on them. In fact, in his own newsletter to the research community, he said, I don't understand even why I've been given these documents. Well, I think it was a mistake. I don't think he should have been looking. He was supposed to have been seeing these numbers. But the interesting thing about it is, even though most of the content is all redacted or blacked out, they didn't black out the numbers on the bottom. And guess what? On these particular pieces of paper, we have cross-referenced the 100 and the 105 and the 65 numbers. And you can trace these back. And these documents pertain to the period between the time when Oswald was getting on the boat and his defection. These files contain dates and references to letters that are pre-defection. Quite an interesting problem, isn't it? What was the FBI's interest in Lee Harvey Oswald prior to October 31st, 1959? That's the day he defected. It was Halloween. Saturday. Well, I don't know what the answer to that is, but the dates are very, very interesting that crop up in these 65 serials. The 2 dates that crop up are the dates that he applied for his passport, no, actually that it was approved, and the second date coincides with the date that he got his visa to go in through Helsinki. Now, it doesn't say Helsinki, it doesn't say visa. These are just dates of letters, but the dates do coincidentally fall on the same dates that he applied for his passport in California and that he got his visa when he was in Helsinki. Now, I know it's just probably a great coincidence, and we must, using the doctrine of restraint that I tried to talk about yesterday and the day before, I think we should restrain ourselves from jumping to that conclusion. But the review board can help us out. They can show us what's behind those dark spots. But the capper on this is, what does the serial 65 stand for? Espionage. That's what it's for. 65 files are espionage files. In any event, I'm going to stop now. The whole problem of the Dallas 105, the Bureau 100, and the headquarters file, the New York files on Oswald, and whatever these 65 serials are, I think is very central to what the FBI knows about Oswald and what the nature of their investigation into him is. And for those of you here in Dallas, you can help me out, you can help out the research community by asking the local FBI office here to release the 105 file here in Dallas. We want to know what's in those files. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I'd like to make an announcement from Al Navis. That I think it's a typical statement of the people that are here that care this weekend that in that
Let's talk afterwards.
quick blitz at the podium, $585 was raised for Penn Jones. I'm going to be talking on the Warren Omission, beginning with the concept that the Warren Commission was made up of 7 individuals with no knowledge of criminal procedure, excepting the report they produced, no knowledge of criminal investigation, pathology, ballistics, or weaponry. Expert witnesses such as Schoenfeld, Frazier, Latona, Cole, Stombaugh, and Cadigan were called to give testimony when people like that, but not necessarily those individuals, should have been on the commission asking the questions. I wrote this up last Wednesday, and it occurred to me as I was looking through it this morning, what I would like you to do, if anybody would be willing to help me with this, my address is in the brochure, some of you have my business card, write down and drop me a line as not necessarily the names, but who should have been on the Warren Commission. Attorneys, doctors, whatever. You don't have to name names, but should it have been the 7 hacks that they had, or who? And I would really like to hear from you, and if we get a decent number, I'll publish it as yet another statistic, as a cross-study of what the Warren Commission should have been. So I would very much like your input. In the key area, the medical results, the Warren Commission either bullied or ignored the Parkland doctors, and in some cases, because the same individual, oral inspector, asked all of the questions, there were clearly indications of subornation of perjury. The doctors were essentially asked or told to lie. Of note, the average Warren Commission witness was asked 225.26 questions. The average doctor was asked 81.3. Clearly, nobody wanted to hear what they had to say, and what they did say was not heard. With respect to the autopsy, 3 career government employees whose future depended on following orders gave the entire autopsy testimony. Humes was asked 215 questions, Colonel Fink was asked 75, and Commander Boswell was asked 14. 123 Warren Commission witnesses were asked 14 or more preliminary questions. State your name, occupation, where do you live? And some were asked in the hundreds. And again, you contrast that to Boswell's entire testimony of 14 questions. As Russell noted this morning, no experts were called to verify the autopsy results. The Warren Commission was made up of, oddly, 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And I think we would have to search our history books in great depth to find a presidential commission made up with a majority like that of the opposition party. Food for thought. In reading and rereading testimony of witnesses again and again and hoping to find that elusive clue, 3 groupings stick out as among the best reading. Group 1 is what I would call the idiots separated at birth, and is composed of Marguerite Oswald and J. Edgar Hoover. Neither of them, you can laugh, I wrote it seriously, neither of them answered the questions that they were asked, as one was too busy trying to prove that Lee Oswald was on the United States payroll, and the other was too busy trying to prove he wasn't. While the American public had a perception of Margaret Oswald as nothing better than a shrew, they should have been allowed to read her testimony side by side with J. Edgar Hoover. And it's nothing more, I suggest to you, than the absurdity of naming that building in Washington the J. Edgar Hoover FBI building. And I hope that does not begin a trend, because I could foresee a future of the Lizzie Borden Department of Forestry, the John Wayne Gacy Department of Agriculture, the John T. Scopes Education Department, and the Al Capone Commerce Building. Group 2 is the strange bedfellows category. Arguably, the two most fascinating bits of testimony given at any time were given by two men, both of whom flat out told the Warren Commission that they were full of crap. Two individuals clearly not separated at birth were General Walker, who did his own investigating and told the Warren Commission that Oswald had not fired at him, and the other one was Mark Lane, who also did his own investigating and told the Warren Commission that he had learned more of the truth on the resources available out of his wallet than the Warren Commission had learned on carte blanche tax dollars. And he's probably right. Group 3 is the Dallas doctors. They told the Warren Commission exactly what it did not want to hear, and as a result they were badgered, harassed, or ignored. In interviewing them, all inspector began with the CYA approach, and of course you know that CYA stands for cover your butt. The clear-cut focus, and I don't know how many of you read this, but it's about 150 pages of testimony for all the doctors, compared with a volume and a half testimony of police officers who watched Oswald being shot, which is available on film anyhow. The clear-cut focus of inspector's investigation is who was there, who was in the room, who was present, who came in, who were the nurses, and it just repeats itself over and over again in a way you say, this guy doesn't want to know what they saw. They're trying to find out who they have to get to and who they have to speak with, and whose testimony, as Russell pointed out this morning, they had to kind of point in the correct direction. And he never explained, is there a hint of why he's asking these questions. But that's the way it went. It's clearly his first priority, and it takes up more space, concern, and number of questions than learning what the doctors did or what they saw. Of course, the Dallas doctors were not career government stooges, and they did know gunshots when they saw them. Although critics have said, well, you know, Dr. Paul Peters is a urologist, with the implication, of course, that makes him ineligible to recognize wounds. And one thing that you have to understand, that Parkland Hospital in 1963 was one of the finest trauma centers anywhere. It's very arguable if John Connolly had been taken anywhere else, he wouldn't have made it. Nevertheless, it was that kind of care treatment because all of these doctors, regardless of their specialty, rotated through the emergency area on a regular basis. Where we can hypothesize that they did see a large number of gunshot wounds. Paul Peters clearly did not spend his time in the emergency room waiting for patients to come in because someone had urinated on them. So what did the doctors have to say? Dr. Carrico, with respect to the head, there seemed to be a 4 to 5 centimeter area of avulsion of the scalp, and the skull was fragmented and bleeding cerebral and cerebellar tissue. Volume 6, page 3. A large gaping wound located in the right occipital-parietal area. I would estimate it to be 5 to 7 centimeters, and of course in the testimony, some of you may have noticed, it says 5 by 71, which allows them to say, well, it was a typo. The whole thing is wrong. 5 by 7 centimeters in size, which is about the size of a baseball. More or less circular, with avulsions of the calvarium and scalp tissue. As I stated before, I believe there were shredded, macerated cerebral and cerebellar tissues, both in the wounds and on fragments of the skull attached to the dura. The throat wound, 4 to 7 millimeters in size, rather round, no jagged edges, no stellate lacerations, and that's something that occurs when a bullet explodes outward and you get that star effect, or what would happen when a person is shot point blank close in. The skin explodes in the same way. He was asked at least 5 times who was present. Dr. Perry also asked at least 5 times who was present. Throat. A small wound in the lower anterior third in the midline of the neck from which blood was exuding very slowly. The wound was roughly spherical to oval in shape, not a punched-out wound, actually, nor was it particularly ragged. It was rather clean cut. Head wound. I noted there was a large wound of the right posterior parietal area in the head exposing lacerated brain. There was blood and brain tissue on the cart, a large evulsive injury to the right occipital parietal area. Question. Are the autopsy findings consistent with your observations? Yes, I think there are no discrepancies at all. There's also indication that Humes called him on Friday, and our inspector cut in, could it have been Saturday morning? Dr. Kemp Clark. I then examined the wound in the back of the president's head. This was a large gaping wound in the right posterior part with cerebral and cerebellar tissue being damaged and exposed. He also noted that Perry said very little at the Saturday press conference, and parenthetically we can say after the phone call from Commander Humes. Inspector to Clark, did you see a hole 2.5 centimeters to the right of the EOP measuring 15 by 6 millimeters? No. And here there is still the belief that the wound of entry was low in the back of the head to the right of the external occipital protuberance, although the House Select Committee would raise it 4 inches years later. Inspector, Dr. Clark, in the line of your specialty, could you comment as to the status of the President with respect to competency, had he been able to survive the head injuries which you have described and the total wound which he had? The answer, ask a silly question, you're going to get a silly answer. The answer includes reference to loss of cerebellar tissue, 2 further mentions of extreme wounds in the rear of the head. The point here is, I think what our inspector was trying to do was put into the record that it wasn't as serious a wound as we have seen it to be since we have been allowed to see something resembling photographs. What he's saying is, could he have survived? Well, of course we know better. And of course they knew better. But when you put it in the record this way, it allows you to think, well, maybe it wasn't that bad. It was, it was a 15 by 6 millimeter hole. He was asked 6 times who was present. Dr. Robert McClellan, I noted the right posterior portion of the skull had been extremely blasted. It had been shattered apparently by the force of the shot so that the parietal bone was protruding up through the scalp and seemed to be fractured almost along its right posterior half. Again, he speaks of cerebellar tissue having been blasted out. The cause of death, I would say, would be massive head injuries with loss of large amounts of cerebral and cerebellar tissue and massive blood loss. The initial hypothesis, as he explained, was throat entrance, deviation, then exiting out the back to produce the massive injury in the head. And you could note here that anybody that said the word cerebellum was not asked if the autopsy findings overlapped with their observation, because in the autopsy findings the cerebellum was intact. Dr. Charles Baxter, whose testimony introduces a new inspector wrinkle, quote, literally the right side of his head had been blown off. With this and the observation that the cerebellum was present, at least a large quantity of it was present on the cart, he's then interrupted to ask, what doctors arrived? Then Inspector asks, having been told the right side of the head, Inspector asked, did you notice any bullet hole below the large opening at the top of the head? The neck wound, 4 to 5 millimeters, it was a very small wound. It did not appear to be a jagged wound such as one would expect with a very high velocity rifle bullet. This would more resemble a wound of entry. Marion Jenkins was asked the usual litany of who was there, but then told he thought the neck wound was an exit. And I suggest here a note to researchers. I've read many sentences that say all Parkland doctors saw a wound of entrance, and they didn't all. Most of them did. The vast majority did. The consensus did, but they didn't all say that. Part of the brain was herniated. I really think that part of the cerebellum, as I recognized it, was herniated from the wound. Dr. Ronald Coy Jones, head. There was a large defect in the back side of the head with what appeared to be some brain hanging out of this wound. Throat wound. Small wound, relatively smooth edges around the wound, a very small, smooth wound. He also noted that he handed in a report in which he indicated the throat wound as a wound of entrance or a wound of exit at such low velocity that the bullet would have just made it through the skin, from where it obviously would have bounced off Kennedy's chest and did all the damage to Connolly. Spector then again suborns perjury, saying, what appeared to be the exit wound in the posterior, when Jones saw what appeared to be the exit wound in the posterior portion, Spector asked, and would that take into account the extensive damage done to the top of the president's head? Dr. Bashur told of seeing a massive head wound and of being visited by a, quote, security officer. Spector, did the Secret Service agent ask you anything other than what you indicated? Now you have to remember, the doctor had only said he had been visited by a security officer. All Inspector, in fact, was obviously aware of who exactly had visited him. Dr. Gene Coleman Aiken, the back of the right occipital parietal portion of the head was shattered with brain substance extruding. I assume the right occipital parietal region was the exit. Paul Peters, and here we have the nominee for the best rehearsed testimony as Arlen Spector. Spector, to Peters, and would you outline briefly the circumstances relating to your arriving on the scene where he, presumably John Kennedy, was? Paul Peters, as I just gave you a little while ago, and this is the second question, so obviously they'd been chatting. Peters is then asked on 9 occasions who was there. In one case, he discussed the steroid treatment, telling he had indication from JFK's physician Berkeley that JFK, quote, was an Addisonian. Spector then turns it around to say that Berkeley had made a request that you treat him as an Addisonian. After the 9 who was there questions, he was asked, now tell us what aid was rendered to President Kennedy. Head, I noticed there was a large defect in the occiput. There appeared to be bone loss and brain loss in that area. We saw the wound of entry in the throat and noted the large occipital wound, and it is a known fact that high-velocity missiles often have a small wound of entrance and a large wound of exit. Dr. Jackie Hunt was also the object of the who was there charade, but she did testify, I actually did not see the wounds. She was then asked, did you at any time see a wound to the head? Dr. Martin G. White testified, I saw the wound in his head as he was brought into the trauma room where he was treated. He was never again asked about that wound. Dr. Richard Brooks Delaney, well, at the time he arrived, his pupils were fixed and dilated, and he had a large head wound. That was the first thing I observed. He's never again asked about that observation, but he is asked repeatedly if the tracheotomy done had obliterated a wound, and he can only say there was a tracheotomy done, he didn't see the wound. So the questioning repeatedly deals with a wound he never saw, and the one he testified to originally is never again referenced. The second nature of the omission is in the quantity versus quality approach. And as I told you the other night, there was 109,930 questions, and you can split them up into 8 different categories, ultimately arriving at 19 witnesses who gave testimony about Tippit with over 3,000 questions, 93 witnesses testifying about the death of Oswald with over 17,000 questions, 177 witnesses testifying about the death of John Kennedy were asked 30,530 questions, and the other 185 witnesses, and I'll be referencing this in a minute, were character witnesses. Oswald's brothers, Ruby's brothers and sisters, Oswald's babysitter from 1942, schoolmates who had not seen him for over a decade, members of the Russian emigre community, some of whom, like Mrs. Igor Vorshinyan, had never met Oswald, and she was asked 334 questions, which is more, for the record, than all of the autopsy doctors combined. The character witnesses, the people who knew about the people but had no knowledge whatsoever of the crime, were asked over 57,000 questions, or more questions than the combined totals regarding the 3 fatalities. And again, as I said the other evening, for those of you here, the most troubling of all the statistics is when you break the 109,930 down into relevant questions about the death of John Kennedy, there were 2,065 relevant questions, or 1.8% of the Warren Commission's total. The other 107,865 are there to fill in 26 shiny books. The name Warren Commission, I would suspect by now, is equally fraudulent, as is their misrepresentation of their labors. The common perception is that the Warren Commission, the commissioners heard 93 witnesses. It is better to suggest that there were 111 witness sessions, because if a witness began in the morning and finished in the afternoon, that's one session. Marina Oswald, however, testifying in February, June, and September cannot be counted as one witness session. Nor can someone's presence at one of her February hearings qualify them as having been present for her September testimony. John, is there a handheld over there? A handheld mic?
There was, but it got
It
moved.
should be right back there,
Okay.
on the floor back there. Oh, that's Kip.
Okay, what I did in going through the working papers, there's the 7 commissioners. This is the indication of, the published indication of when they were present for witness testimony. In fact, in these indications, they were not present when they said they were. This is the number of complete hearings that were attended. This column represents the number of partial hearings that were attended. This indicates when they were present but asked no questions, and this indicates the number of times when that particular member chaired a hearing. Just that one. Figure 2 is the number of questions they asked. Alan Dulles, far and away the leader. This is the percentage of the Warren Commission's total, and this is the percentage of the overall total. So you get down here to Richard Russell asked 1/5 of 1% of the questions asked by the Warren Commission. The commissioners themselves asked 6,964 questions. Again, Dulles being involved there. I'm going to use the first one first. Going back here, I created a matrix to try and make some, I did several, and the one I came up with that I think best represents their labors is I took this column, the times that you can't count when they weren't there. I counted the number of times they were present and gave them 2 points if they were present the whole time in here. I gave them 1 point if they were present for part of a hearing. If they didn't say anything, I subtracted a point. The winner far and away, by the way, is Alan Dulles. Now I need that one. When we compare participation in terms of physically being there and the number of questions they asked, you get a remarkable correlation. Dulles is first in both categories, Ford is second in both categories. Warren, Cooper, and McCloy variously go 3, 4, and 5. Boggs is 6th, and Russell is 7th. If you add to that the fact that more off-the-record testimony occurred at either the insistence, the urging, or the suggestion of Alan Dulles, we can, individual is misspelled down here, we can reasonably restructure the nomenclature of the Warren Commission and give it its proper name, the Dulles Commission. The murder of the President of the United States was essentially presided over by the former head of the CIA, whom JFK had fired. If nothing else troubles us about the President's Commission on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, that fact certainly should. Could we bring up the lights, please? I'd like to close with 2 thoughts. And some of this touches on what John spoke about in a little bit different way than what he said. Essentially, I don't think we can find, except in some of the CDs, the commission documents, which are not published, as opposed to the CE, the exhibits which were. Occasionally in there, thoughts flashed across somebody's mind, but they never did any thinking. They knew what they wanted you to say, they called you in, they got you to say it, they ran you out. Abe Zapruder's last statement to the Warren Commission was, well, you know, there were indications there were 2 people involved. Wesley Lieber looks him in the eye and says, your film was very helpful, thank you. I mean, Zapruder's got no axe to grind, he's laughing all the way to the bank. They never did any thinking. And I did a little point-counterpoint using Abe Zapruder, the weather, and the motorcade, because when John Kennedy's vision for America, his dreams ended, Zapruder's nightmares began. Zapruder worked in the Dowtex building. He wanted to film the event. He wanted to literally shoot films. Keyword there being shoot. He didn't bring his camera to work that day because the weather would not, at that time he went to work, the weather was such that he was not going to be able to shoot. Yet we're asked to believe that a gunman at the same hour was bringing a weapon into the depository, with all indications at that moment that there'd be a bubble top on the car, which would make whatever was going to happen more difficult. It's not going to prevent anything, as we know, but it's certainly going to make your job a lot more difficult, particularly since you don't know how to shoot in the first place and your gun is junk. So what happens? The weather clears up, Zapruder goes home to get the camera. Does he shoot from the Daltex building, as many people have postulated? No. Where does he go? 6 feet away from the corner of the grassy knoll. He wanted to shoot the best pictures. He's an amateur photographer. What do you think a professional gunman is going to do? And nobody ever thought about this kind of stuff. They just didn't think. And if Abe Zapruder's got enough common sense to get out of the Daltex building and go stand up there where you got a commanding view, where you can't miss getting the best pictures, you'd think somebody that knows anything about firing guns to kill would at least have the same mentality. They didn't think. I'd like to share with you some of the names of some of the people that were called, and if these don't sound like household words, it's because they aren't. And then I'm going to go through the names of some of the people that they missed, and I think you'll see a comparison here. People called included, again, they're not household names. William Shelley, Nat Pinkston, Doris Burns, George Applin, Daniel Lujan, Edward Shields, William Wolfe, Benarietta Smith, Viola Peterman, Myrtle Evans, Hiram Conway, sound familiar? Evelyn Ziegel, Philip Garacci and Vincent Blaylock, who were two teenagers that were in Bringair's store schmoozing when Oswald came in with the Marine manual. James J. Tormey, Donald Brooks, Irving Statman, Richard Hewlin, Carol Seeley, Charles Greener. And Charles Greener, it was Dial Ryder's boss, and he had to come and testify that Dial was basically an honest guy with respect to that Oswald repair tag. Robert Fenley, Eric Rogers, James Lehrer, Willie Slack, Jimmy Turner, Harold Fuqua, Alfredia Riggs, John Servants, Sidney Evans, W.W. Litchfield, William Beavers, Don Goyen, who was one of the drivers of the armored car that never did anything, Edward Pullman, Herbert Kravitz, Kenneth Dow, John Branch, and I'm going to stop with the name Stanley Kaufman. He was Jack Ruby's accountant, and he was asked, do you know how Ruby got into the building to shoot Oswald? The question is, believe it or not, that's one of the to-the-point questions, because it is valid. Of course, it's if they ask me, they could ask me the same question. I don't know how he got in. And to ask Ruby's accountant that question, it has to be counted as valid because it's a valid question. They just asked the wrong person. They might as well have asked Marina Oswald or the head of the Secret Service in Washington. But I think there was something basically unfair there in asking Ruby's accountant how Ruby got into the basement. If they were going to do that, they should have asked Ruby how to depreciate long-term bonds without having to pay a lot of capital gains tax. Now, think of the people they did not call. David Ferry, Julia Ann Mercer, William and Gail Newman, Gordon Novell, Sylvia Duran and Eusebia Askew, Tom Tilson, Alan Sweat, O.V. Campbell, Marilyn Sitzman, Aquila Clemens, Spaz T. Rankin, the entire other 7 Secret Service agents in the follow-up car who were never called, Gordon Arnold, Mary Woodward and the other 3 journalists who were standing right at the first sign, Charles Bronson, Robert Hughes, Orville Nix, Mary Muchmore, all the people that took those other films, Ed Butler, Guy Bannister, Arcacha Smith, Joseph Miltier, Willie Mitchell, who was one of the other convicts on the 6th floor of the jail building where Mr. Posner tells us was the insane asylum of the jail, who had some interesting things to say. Mrs. Tippett, they called the other widows, Father Oscar Huber. And in years past, I've always said, well, maybe because of, it's a sacramental type situation. He spoke openly about the event for many years, and if he's willing to speak about it, let's put him on the record, and let's ask him what he saw, because I don't think he's going to lie to us. Gerald Custer and the other 31 identifiable people who were at the autopsy and who were not called, and whose names didn't even become known for many years. The two police, James Cheney and the other motorcycle officer who were not called, that were next to the car. Of the four motorcycle officers, the two on the left were called, the two on the right weren't. Admiral George Berkeley, Siebert and O'Neill. I would love to ask them about their report. As you know, David Lifton has made a living out of the Siebert and O'Neill report. And if you look at the names in there, you'll never find out who was at the autopsy because they're all wrong. Galloway becomes Holloway. They're close, but they're wrong. And either these two guys never went to FBI school or somebody dummied up that report somehow. David Sanders, the orderly who put Kennedy's body, who cleaned Kennedy's body. He can tell us where the wound was at the base of the back of the neck. Jerry Boyd Belknap, the epileptic. He paid his bill at Parkland Hospital on December 2nd. They knew who he was. J. Walton Moore, who was George de Morenshill's CIA contact. Aubrey Reich, who was a guest here this week, and the other people from the O'Neill Company. William Bruce Pitzer, who took some photographs in the autopsy room and later, with the help of covert operatives, committed suicide. All of the people on the railroad overpass. Mary Mormon, William Gaudet, who accidentally happened to be a CIA agent and get the tourist visa right after Oswald's Mexican adventure. Eugene Hale Brading, Donald Wayne House, Jack Lawrence, Larry Flora, Donald Sharp, all the people that were taken into custody. The only other person besides Oswald that was taken into custody and questioned was Buell Wesley Frazier. Dr. Earl Rose. I'm sure he could have told us some interesting things if asked. O.P. Wright. Richard Johnson, who supposedly carried the magic bullet in his pocket to Washington, and in 1994, as we speak, does not have much recollection of that event. He's very vague on it today. Paul Grudy, the director of Miller Funeral Home, who had to clean the fingerprint ink off Oswald's corpse for reasons as yet unknown. Beverly Oliver, our guest this weekend. Ed Hoffman, our guest this weekend. Walter Kirk Coleman, key witness in the shooting at the Walker residence. Gary Patrick Hemming, whom I think needs to be studied very carefully before we close the case here. Dr. Charles Crenshaw. Special Agent Roger Warner, who interviewed one of the people arrested besides Oswald. Richard Case Nagel. Anybody that's going to do jail time for a bank robbery because he doesn't want to be someplace on November 22nd obviously has an interesting story to tell. We're thankful to Dick Russell for telling it to us, but it would have been nice if the Warren Commission knew about it. And I have 200 names here, and I'm going to close with this one. Yuri Nasenko. Thank you very much. We would certainly be happy to entertain your questions at this time. If you would indicate to whom the question is asked and then ask your question, please. I don't think you're coming through.
For John Newman, just a clarification on the 65 number. In what sense does that refer to espionage?
Any 65 series file is an espionage file.
Okay, but is that espionage by the United States or espionage to the United States?
You know, Bill Turner might be able to answer that question better than I would assume either way. It doesn't really matter. It's just espionage in nature. And of course, because the dates are pre-defection, it's very, very tantalizing that there should be an espionage file on Oswald before he defects, if in fact there is. But I'll hold back on that. I just want to see what's in these documents.
Also, very quickly, my name is Hal Verb. Russ, when we were discussing that Hester document, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, maybe I did, but when I was in Washington and I was examining the Nix film, you can see the Hesters running back. And in other films, the reaction of most of the people is to get away from the firing. When I looked at the Nix film, the Hesters are running as if they're trying to see who is firing from behind. In the next issue of Dateline Dallas, I wrote an article, and they've delayed it for, oh God, about 6 months. I will have more information about another witness who doesn't necessarily refer to what the Hesters were doing, but it supports what the Hesters were doing in the film. And another thing, we can discuss this later, but another thing about the plywood floor that was being set and hearing the shells fall on the floor. Now, I haven't verified this, and I'm sure the Dallas Historical Building can verify it. There's a gentleman here who is from that, used to be with that. I was told that the floor is 18 inches thick, and you are aware of that. And it is difficult for me. I asked Harold Norman, I was present with another researcher, how did you happen to hear something that's 18 inches thick? He kind of shrugged and said, well, it went click, click, boom, boom, click, click, boom, boom. I didn't pursue it any further, but you might want to comment. And then just very quickly, somebody made a comment about the Oswald remark about at 7:55 p.m., I forget who it was who was referring to it. It may have been you. But you may also be aware of this. Seth Cantor in his notebook. The incident was Oswald was being told by Hill, well, you better get set. All the reporters are coming in, and you may want to cover your face. Oswald says, I don't have to do that. I have nothing to be ashamed of. At that very moment, in Cantor's notebook, he's saying, I'm just a patsy. It's not the first time Oswald said that. And then finally for John, you might be interested in this. We can discuss this later, because the things you mentioned refresh my memory. It has to do with both the FBI files and the CIA files. You may not be aware of this. Recently, I contacted an agent who was in the field office on that day. He's not in the Warren report. He's not in the volumes, but I have the file in which he is included. And we were discussing the nature of Oswald as an informant. And it's interesting, he may be aware of the file that you're referring to. He said that there was a file that was being opened on Oswald, the effort of having Oswald as an informant. He didn't say that Oswald was an informant, but I'll give you his name and address where you can contact him. As far as the CIA files about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was not mentioned, Tony Summers called me excitedly when he was doing this article, which appeared, in which you also appeared, about his article on Case Reopened. And he said, I just found a file on the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. It's dated 1962. My name happens to be in it twice because I was a member of Fair Play for Cuba at that time. But I said, the more important file would be the 63 file. Do you have that? And I said, the reason why that would be more important? That would have to have Oswald as being in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He was on radio, he was on TV, newspapers. He said, yes, I do have that file, and how his name is not in that file. So you might want to comment on this, any of the three of you.
Could you restate your question? Hal's a dear friend of mine. I'd just like to speak with respect to the Harold Norman thing. I'm sure you all know from the Spence Bugliosi trial or from testimony as well as from that book we've been talking about. Harold Norman is saying, well, I heard boom, click, click, boom, click, click, boom. And in my last telephone conversation with him, I said, but Harold, they found a live round in that gun when they found it. So you would have had to hear an extra click, click. And he was like, I'll be damned. 30 years have gone by and nobody's ever said that to me. And of course, I asked him about the stuff falling on his head, and he said, no. He also denounced Posner as a misquoter, so to speak.
I'd like to comment on that, on Norman Williams and Jarman on the 6th floor. If you want an interesting study in changing a position, you might compare their FBI reports, their statements to the Dallas Sheriff's Office on the one hand with their Secret Service documents in which they were re-interviewed by the Secret Service. A researcher in Oakland, California, Pat Lambert, has compiled an extensive paper on that, which she shows how Norman, Jarman, and Williams' testimony or their statements begin to dovetail after their original statements in Dallas, especially after Secret Service interviews. And I have copies of that document, but Pat Lambert did this work in the late 60s, I believe, and it's really remarkable.
To his credit, Harold Norman, in front of the Warren Commission, disavowed some of the reports. And he's one of the few people that had the courage to do it. And again, we spoke this morning about his particular situation with respect to 1963, and that took courage. It really did. Yes, ma'am.
Joyce Davis from Georgia. And I have first a comment to you, Mr. Brown, about your question of who should have been on the Warren Commission. That has troubled me, too. And my thought was, why were there not some good friends of Kennedy on that commission? Why were there not...
Well, they had Alan Dulles.
Why were there not... some northern liberals? For example, why was Claiborne Pell not on that committee? If we had to pick Southerners, why was not Senator Smathers from Florida on that committee? Those are the two people I would suggest if we're staying in Congress. I don't know who the experts would be, but those are my comments about that.
Yeah, at the same time, though, those are not investigators.
No, I understand.
Certainly, there should have
that.
been somebody there to stand up for John Kennedy, absolutely.
No, that wasn't the reason I said that, because
Yeah.
I can't speak to the professionals, but that was just my comment if we had to pick someone from Congress. Now, the second thing I want to ask is generally to everyone who might have had some knowledge of all the documents that I haven't had. I've just been reading this, but every time I read about the curtain rods and the package, I always read about the package, and I read, of course, that the package that Oswald held, according to Frazier, could not be the gun because taken apart, the gun does not fit that size and how it was held. My question is, has anyone found any evidence of what could have been carried in by Oswald? Has anyone ever found curtain rods, is my question.
They didn't search for curtain rods until, August? And they contacted Mr. Truly in August of '64 to see if anybody had found any curtain rods around the school book depository. And 8 months later?
Despite what you might read in books for sale in there, the crime scene search was abominable. There's photographs in the exhibit section of the published, in the 26 volumes, there's photographs showing Oswald's clipboard taken on November 22nd, and they mysteriously found it in another location
Right.
10 days later or so. And as far as, interestingly enough, on curtain rods, they went back, they had a serious problem. They had to go back to the Payne household, and when they got to the garage out there with all the clutter and nonsense, what do they find wrapped up in brown paper but curtain rods?
Right. There were curtain rods in the Payne's garage.
And they measured all of the Secret Service agent that was it was Mrs. Payne, who was the most questioned person before the Warren Commission with over 5,000 questions, which should tell us something. It was Mrs. Payne, it was whoever was, I think it might have been Jenner, Counsel Jenner, and a Secret Service agent named John Joe Howlett. And they had him measure every window in the Payne house to make sure that those 91 curtain rods out in the garage fit at least one window there. And then they went down and measured North Beckley to, quote, prove that the curtain rods that were still there would not have fit what little window Oswald, whatever. But it still raises questions.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, just as a sidebar, to my understanding, Wesley Frazier still works in the book business. But prior to entering upon that, he worked in essentially in notions and hardware, and he regularly sold curtain rods.
Yeah, and it might be noted that James Daugherty, who saw Oswald enter the school book depository that morning, said he had nothing in his hands, in spite of question after question after question from a rather incredulous Joe Ball, I believe. Finally, in defense of Southern conservatives here, whom you wanted to exclude from the commission, I think it's noteworthy, I'm being facetious, but I think it's noteworthy that the two biggest skeptics on the commission were Russell and Boggs. Yes.
A devil's advocate. A devil's advocate. Absolutely. Russell wants to go back to something that Hal had asked, I believe.
I just wanted to say to Hal, yeah, what I was doing with the Hester testimony was just evidence of what I'd like to call, with regard to the Warren Commission, selective amnesia. That testimony which did not either fit their conclusions or would as, in case one of the commissioners said, I don't know exactly who it was, they were supposed to close doors instead of opening them. And this would have opened a lot more. And one other thing, 18-inch floors and 2-inch plywood, a little bit of a difference, I would think.
You wouldn't have known if an elephant had died up there, much less a cartridge hitting the floor.
Well,
With a parade going by. Go ahead.
I do want to say one other thing. If you have an opportunity before you leave, please go down to the 6th floor and look at that stairwell. You have to come out onto the floor, round the corner, and go down the stairwell. There is not any way that you cannot either be seen or heard.
Wanted to respond to Hal's question about the FPCC. I want to repeat Hal Verb's question. I don't know if you spoke loud enough, but I think it's an important question, so I would like to repeat it. Tony Summers, who wrote the Vanity Fair article, made, I think, a very good discovery, and it relates to what I'm going to do tonight. That discovery was that the FPCC list of persons, and this list was generated after the assassination, by the way. I believe it's 1964, but I'd have to check. I have a copy of it. In any event, this list, which was a fairly thick document, I'm going to say maybe a quarter-inch thick, did not contain Lee Harvey Oswald's name in it. That's amazing. This is after the assassination. His activities in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee by that time are legendary. I would say they were in any event even before the assassination, but certainly afterwards. And the idea that the CIA would, this is an internal document, by the way, this is not something that was published for the public. This was a CIA internal study of the FPCC, and Oswald's name wasn't on it. It's very, very, very interesting. And my answer, I will defer a total answer to that question because it relates to what I'm going to do tonight, but I'll just tell you that I consider that a defect, and that there are a number of defects where Oswald's activities are missing from internal CIA documents. I'm going to show you them tonight, but in all instances, the piece that is missing is Oswald's Cuban escapades. And this would just be one more example of that, and we'll talk about that tonight.
If I could just say one other thing, if any of you would like to see what I've got or have any questions, I'll be glad to make you, I've got hard copies here, I'll be glad to help you out in any way I can.
I'm Jim Alvord from Carlsbad, California. A question for Mr. Brown. I think it's a fair statement to say that most of the people in this room have probably read the summary to the Warren Commission report. It would also be a fair statement to say that very, very few of us have actually read the entire report with the 26 volumes. How well does the summary actually encapsulate what is found in the volumes, or is this another opportunity for the Commission to whitewash the evidence?
Well, let me begin the answer. If you read the Bible and then wanted to go see the movie and wound up in a porno house, that's about what it would be like. Believe me, there is the worst thing that happens, I have to tell you, having read the 26 volumes 3 times, after you've done that, you go back and you say, because the Warren report is 888 pages, but the summary is 25 pages. You know, everything you ever needed to know about Lee Harvey Oswald's guilt is 25. It's remarkable. I mean, there is not, except the fact that Lee Oswald, and there might be 9 or 10 of them, existed. There is no correlation. There is absolutely, words are twisted. And I don't say this, as an attitude or an agenda. I mean, they just flat out misrepresented. And of course, Alan Dulles said very few people will read the 26. A few professors will read. At least several professors here. It's so different. You know, and when you get away from the report and you get into the 26 or into the House Select or into FOIA documents or whatever you can get your hands on, then you go back and you say, well, I'm going to read the 25-page Warren report. Just it's an exercise in fiction. It boggles your mind if you haven't been near it. for 4 or 5 years and you haven't read those 25 pages, you go back to it and it's just, this is crazy. This is absolute lunacy.
Let me say something about the report versus the 26 volumes. There are, as he said, discrepancies, omissions, even to the point, in some cases, footnotes that don't lead anywhere. People discovered a memo a few years ago when they released some of the Commission's papers in which one of the counsel says, well, if we fudge this footnote, you think anybody will notice that we've got CE really, something or other refers to another CE, but if we go ahead and fudge the number, you think anybody will notice. Well, obviously, they didn't think anybody would notice, and they went ahead. Mark Lane was the first to discover phantom footnotes that didn't have any reference. Just to choose one example, the report states that Darrell Tomlinson testified that he found the bullet on Governor Connolly's stretcher. The reference is to a page or pages in Volume 6. And when one turns to Volume 6, you find that what Darrell Tomlinson actually said was that he found the bullet on the other stretcher. And yet this is cited as the source of the statement made in the report. An exhaustive study, I guess I can accept Walt's comparison of the Bible and the porno shop, but certainly there are massive irregularities which one wouldn't be aware of if one read the report, but would be aware of if he then bothered to look in the volumes. And I think I think what I've said there is just being terribly generous to the compilers of it too.
Let me just add something with respect to what John had said earlier when he was talking about the file about the money transfers, and the title was something like
Funds transmitted to Russia.
Yeah.
Funds transmitted to Russia. Okay, that's a file name. When you go through the 26 volumes, there are documents that have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with Lee Harvey Oswald, and the title on the file is Lee Harvey Oswald. The other thing that's curious, and this comes out in the 26 as just a glaring problem, and it comes out in the Warren Commission as gospel, is there are many, many instances where the Commission introduces a fact, and there's dialogue between themselves. Do we have a witness to prove it? Do we have? Don't worry, we'll get one. Now that we have this fact, by God, we're going to prove it somehow. We'll shove the words into somebody's mouth. But they start with the assumption.
Yeah, there's a memo, for example, having to do with the palm print on the rifle, which, as late as August of '64. There is a memo in which I think Rankin contacts the FBI, and he says that the members of the Warren Commission are still not convinced that this is legitimate palm print removed from the rifle, yet within a month they go to press with the absolute statement that it is.
And they were still so uncertain, they called Gallagher to talk about the neutron activation analysis because, what Cosner says, science can prove the elephant with the hanging over a cliff on a daisy, whatever. They called him to testify about neutron activation analysis and the spectrographic analysis of the bullets on September 15th, and the galleys of the Warren Commission report had been circulating for 11 days already. So what's he going to tell them? Now, again, give us a fact and we'll find somebody. Yes, sir.
Yes, I want to refer to the infamous Friday night press conference. And whoever can give me this information, it's probably already published, certain people probably already know it, but just for my own information. Jack Ruby, who of course corrected was the Dallas District Attorney? Or
Henry Wade.
It was Henry Wade.
Yes.
With the Fair Play Cuba, when he had said Free Cuba Committee. Ruby's presence at that press conference, at some point it came out in some way that he was there as an interpreter for an Israeli newspaper reporter. Where did that information come from?
It didn't come from anything published in the 26 volumes, I can tell you that.
Had anybody ever heard that before?
No, that's a commonly floated story because the Dallas police, if you've ever seen external pictures of headquarters taken that day, they had enough cable going in through people's office windows, I mean, literally to connect Dallas to Mars. And they threw press badges just out on a table, help yourself. Anybody that had,
I believe in part of the videotape, he has a notepad and pencil.
yeah, he's got his glasses on and he's taking notes. But that's for show. And Oswald walked immediately past him to enter that. Oswald was brought right past Ruby. Ruby was at the door, suggesting he probably left the gun outside because Oswald was alive the next morning.
Was it ever ascertained if there was an Israeli reporter there?
There were numerous foreign correspondents.
Whom Ruby was acting with?
No,
or
not to
helping?
my understanding. Can anybody help with that?
Great question.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah, because I was just struck by the fact that we've now come to know that the American press overseas is acting as intelligence agents, and I just wondered if there was ever anything brought up because of this new book that's come out, which...
I would think there'd be enough intelligence agents in there already that they wouldn't need foreigners.
Yeah.
Great question. What prize do we have for the winner of Stump the Band today? Dishes, luggage, I don't know. We'll work on something.
I'm voicing for Ed Hoffman. For Mr. Brown. I have a question for you. Do you know if it's important? On the 6th floor, by the window. I'm wondering if a policeman, when he hurried up, he went inside, he went up. Could he smell the gun smoke? That's my question for you. Could he smell gun smoke when he got up to the window there? And
Absolutely.
The Warren Commission.
Given the configuration of the sniper's nest, of what we call the sniper's nest, if shots had been fired there,
So when he got up there,
they should absolutely have been aware of the smell of cordite.
he says,
Absolutely.
yes. But his question is, did they smell anything? Or is it,
No,
is it
there is no indication of that whatsoever. No. Of course,
important to know?
the problem
Important to know
there,
where the smoke comes from first. Yeah. It's important you'd smell it. If you can't smell anything, it means that it's probably just a lie.
yeah,
Didn't-
there are,
That's a very important point. It's got to write it down in the Warren Commission.
yeah, there are a number of people that testified in the motorcade that they smelled gunpowder, but nobody ever got up there and indicated that they smelled gunpowder in that corner where they should have, given that the window was only open to a height of 6 bricks. You can see that in the Dillard photo. And the troubling part is there were people on the ground, people that Russell spoke about earlier. A number of people got to the police right away and said, we saw a gun up there. Well, that's at 12:31, and the police got up there at 1:12. What were they doing? What were they thinking about? And those same police officers ran right past Harold Norman, going up the stairs, Junior Jarman and Bonnie Ray Williams, and I said to Harold Norman, as an African American, were you outlawed as an assassin at that time? They were ignored. And any police officer, I mean, they didn't say 6th floor window, they said up there, up top. And nobody, is the first floor number 1 or is the one above the ground floor number 1? There can be confusion there. Anybody up there, in normal police procedure, would have been pinned against the wall.
And the Warren Commission did grapple with this question as to just why it took so long from the time of the pinpointing at 12:34 of that particular window until 1:12, 1:16, when the sniper's nest was actually found. And some inquiries were made. Hoover and his answer had to do with something about traffic building up around the area and difficult for people to get in there, et cetera, et cetera. This was in the same reply where he talked about
Possibly also leaves in the trees also.
where he talked about the trees preventing a shot on Houston Street. It was in the same, it was that same document. But the Warren Commission was aware of the discrepancy between the time of the noting of the window and the time of the discovery of what was in the window.
Okay, thank you all very much.
There's one more.
I'm sorry, forgive me.
Stephen Morley from England. My question is to Mr. Newman. I think I heard you correctly saying that there were FBI files on Oswald in a number of American cities, Washington, Dallas, New Orleans. I think you said Chicago as well.
Yes.
Would you think, could you explain the relevance of that file in Chicago in particular, or do you think there's anything suspicious about a file in Chicago on Oswald?
Not really, because the Chicago FBI field office was conducting a large investigation of the FPCC. In fact, I've never seen all the files. I just know that in the FBI documents I'm looking at, that I see in the appendices up in the upper left-hand corner, the very distinctive CH dash and the number, which is the document submitted from the Chicago FBI field office. So at this point, because of what I was talking about earlier, I bail out and I'm satisfied with saying that we are not being told about all the FBI files on Oswald, and until we are, who knows what the reasons are, what's in them. So, but I do know, as a starter, that the Chicago office conducted a massive investigation in the FPCC. It was just released in the new files. It's about this thick. And some of the materials from that study were folded into Oswald reports in other FBI field offices.
Thank you.
Since yours was the last question, I think we can conclude on the thought with, if there's anything in any of those files that's incriminating about Oswald with respect to the assassination, we would have seen it already, but we haven't. Thank you.
It's not here. I was making notes about the file. Would it be accurate